So do you believe me when I tell you that you've got a phone inside of you? It's ringing every day. Good old-fashioned phone with a handle. And every day we receive a call. We are part of the Reformed tradition. That's what Reformation means. We are part of the Reformed tradition, and it is basic. It is basic to the Reformed tradition that each of us receive a call. Calvin in particular taught that everyone has a calling. The first question of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, that back in the day, and I mean back in the day, you had to know the Westminster Shorter Catechism in order to be a church member. And the first question is, what is the chief end of man? Now today, because we are liberated and progressive, we would write that question, what is the chief end of life? That's the question. That's what a catechism is. It's a series of questions and answers, questions and answers. What is the chief end of man? And the answer is, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Now, we wouldn't write that today. The answer would be, the chief end of life is to glorify God and enjoy God forever. And Calvin taught that the way we do that is we answer the call. Some are called to be butchers. Some are called to be bakers. Calvin was trying to wed so-called secular life with God. And Calvin said, no, don't do that. You have a calling. Some are called to be butchers, bakers, candlestick makers. Some are called to be pastors. And when you find your calling, you glorify God. And oh yeah, enjoy God. You have found your calling. One of the things that made such an impression on me during college summer years is when I worked in factories in Central Ohio to make money for college, and I hated it. Especially working at Rockwell International on an assembly line. I was a card-carrying United Auto worker, and we made truck axles for military vehicles, and I hated it. I hated being inside, all for 8 to sometimes more hours in the glory of summer, and I'm not very good at working with my hands. I wasn't good at it. I hated it. Made good money. And here was one of my takeaways. There were men and women there who loved it. They loved working with their hands. They loved making a good buck for them and their families, and they liked going to work. So I would explain to them, you're just like what Calvin was talking about. No, I didn't do that. That was a big mistake. But I thought it, and I'm thinking it now. It's a calling. So what we just heard is Luke's very interesting and strange rendition of Jesus calling his first disciples. Here's what it's like. I think this is what it's like. Because I want you to notice there's a couple of strange and weird things happening here, and one of them is that Simon, who later became Peter, Simon Peter, did you catch that part where he's afraid? And he's sensing something life-changing is going on, that Jesus is calling him. And did you catch that he said, no, get away from me. This This is too much, this is scaring me. And then he says this interesting thing. He says, I'm a sinful man. Simon Peter was making the common mistake that many of us make, that you have to be good to do the work of God. Now this is dangerous stuff. We wouldn't teach our children this. We would never say to our children, you don't have to be good. Who would do that? But the reality is you don't have to be good to do the perfect will of God. You just have to answer that call. Stop trying to be so good. Can you imagine the preacher standing up here and saying, what did the preacher out today? He said, stop trying so hard to be good. It's good to be good. Choose goodness. But don't get hung up on how imperfect you are. God calls imperfect people to do perfect things. And I think every day is a little bit like this. I told you this once before, it was about a year ago, and I'm going to tell you again. And then I'm going to finish up by telling you about my cousin Bill, who I also told you about a year ago. But first there's this. Deep waters. By the way, deep waters are where the big fish are. And what's the biggest fish that you're ever going to catch? The biggest fish that you will ever catch is you. I want you to think about that today. And you got to go into the deep waters to catch that fish. And deep waters are deep, and deep waters are frightening. Deep waters are unexplored. And today, we are being called to go into the deep waters of our psyche and our souls, and what we're going to find there is the biggest fish of all, us, through the grace of Christ. I think this is what every day is like. Once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away, in a land far, far away, there was a king. And the king lived in the castle, the grand, majestic castle, and the castle was surrounded by a deep water moat. And this deep water moat went all around the castle, and inside the moat were crocodiles, alligators, sea serpents, everything imaginable that will take away your life. Now the king had a problem. The king did not have any children. And the king was getting on in years, so the king decided, I need to find out who's going to be my successor. So the king gathered all of the young men and women, because the kingdom was in a liberated and progressive region. The king included all the young men and women of the kingdom. And the king stood on the side of the castle, and on the other side of the moat were all the young men and women of the kingdom. And the king addressed the crowd and said, whoever has the courage to dive into this moat and swim to the other side and stand with me, you will be my successor. And as soon as the king said it, splash! There was a splash. And because this is a liberated and progressive kingdom, it was a young woman.
Yes!
A young woman into the water. And immediately all were amazed, because she swam with great speed and courage, and all of the terrible sea creatures were trying to nip at her, and she jumped up, breathing, on the other side, and she made it, and she stood beside the king, and all were amazed. And the king said to the young woman, my child, you did it. One day all of this will be yours. And in the meantime, what can I do for you now? And the young woman turned to the king and said, you can get me the name of the person who pushed me in that boat. You saw that coming, right? Look, our democracy is under an attack. And it's not just our democracy. Certain groups of people that the United Church of Christ loves and supports are under attack. And it's scary. And we have been pushed into the waters. And we are up for it. We are up for it. I'll finish with this. It's the deep waters. And in the deep waters you can find the big fish. We can find ourselves, and we can also find the people in our lives who aren't just alive, but are living. My cousin Bill and I, we weren't old enough to drive. He was from Bell Vernon, Pennsylvania. Not Mount Vernon, Bell Vernon, Pennsylvania, which is located across I-70 from Monessen, Pennsylvania, my mother's hometown. My cousin Bill, I loved him. I loved Bill so much. He was a year older than me, and he wasn't just alive. Bill knew how to live. And shoulder-length red hair, never shut up, drove my parents crazy. Always smiling, always laughing, always into mischief. Heart of gold. I think we were both, I think he was maybe 8th grade, maybe I was 7th. Neither one of us drove. He spent 2 weeks with us one summer in Marysville, and one day, it was straight out of Tom Sawyer Huck Finn. We got on our bikes. I got on my bike, he got on my brother's bike, and we had our fishing rods and our tackle boxes, and we rode our bikes. It was a couple miles outside of town to McIver's farm, my dad's best friend in the church, and McIver's farm had a farm pond. The farm pond had a boat, and Bill and I said to each other, let's do it like they did it in Luke 5. Let's get in the boat and go out into the deep waters. And I didn't know it then, but I know it now. We were trying to catch big fish, but what I caught that day was my cousin Bill. I caught him. And we got out there. We had red and white bobbers. And we threw our line into the water, and not long thereafter we were just talking, and I looked for my bobber, and my bobber was gone. It was gone. And I pulled on my line, and it was tight. And I started to reel it in. And it was barely coming in. And all of a sudden, I said, I'm going to hold this. And all of a sudden, my fishing rod line was taking us from one side of that pond to the other, like this. And after a while, a long while, 45 minutes, finally I kept reeling it in, and finally I saw my bobber. And that's when it happened. It ended up, we measured it later, it was a 24-inch catfish. And we saw the head of that thing, and we both were like Simon Peter. We were afraid. We said, we're not getting that thing. It had those whiskers, they were that long. And we looked at that fish and said, we're not getting that thing in the boat with us. So Bill rowed the boat to the shore, and we got out. I dragged that poor fish out of the water. We didn't have cameras. Now this is about living. This is about Jesus calls us every day to do something that frightens us, to do something. And Jesus is the one that says, don't be afraid. You can do this. So we got on our bikes, we knew nobody would believe us, and we rode to my house. I held that fish. We put it in my kitchen sink. Nobody was home. My mom got home after a little while. It was the first time I ever heard her curse. First time. Get that fish out of my sink. I don't remember now. Somehow everybody ended up coming home. My brother and my sister and my dad, and they were all, and fish is still alive. We got in my mom's car. We decided we were going to let the fish live. And with God as my witness, it was like a Disney movie because that fish was still alive, and we put it in the water, but it didn't move. This is why when you write narratives, you create tension, right? That fish didn't move. Now I just wanted that thing to live. And after about 5 or 10 minutes, slowly that fish swam off. Now, warning, tragedy coming. A few years later, Bill graduated from high school, joined the Air Force. He was on delayed entry. He had the summer off, and then he was going to go in the Air Force. The Youghiogheny River in Pennsylvania flows very close to Belle Vernon, Pennsylvania. And one beautiful summer day, Bill and some of his buddies went to the river, and they were playing frisbee. And the Youghiogheny is a whitewater river, and Bill went into the deep waters to get the frisbee, and he didn't come out. And I was always so struck by that. By the way, prayers for those giving help and prayers for those who need help. I'm always struck by that tragic irony of the gift of the water as we caught that fish, and the tragedy of the water that took Bill's life. Deep water. Deep water. So Bill lives on in me, and you've got the Bills in your life, and they live on. And every day, the phone is ringing, and it's calling us, yes? And we answer, and we're not just alive, we live. Because every day, Jesus is calling and says, don't be afraid. You can do this. Amen?
Amen.
Amen.